Hey, this is Benjamin Boyce. I have an interview with James Cantor coming up and going to be posted in a couple days here. And James Cantor is a sexologist stationed in Toronto, Ontario. He's like one of the leading experts in the field. I've had him on my channel before, and I interviewed him again. And nominally, I interviewed him about this listserv that he's a part of, or was a part of, called the SSSS, or the Quad S. And we'll get into that a little bit later about what it was and how it's changed over time. What I want to do in this preliminary episode is to talk about an article that he wrote and then shared on this listserv, and then he got canceled for this article. And I'm going to read his article, and then I'm going to read one particularly interesting bit of cancellation propaganda, or just cancellation expression, from one of the other members of this listserv. I just think it's really fascinating the ways in which certain behavior is being allowed to propagate within these so-called professional societies, or professional climes, let's say. So James Cantor wrote this blog post called "When is a TERF Not a TERF?" And he wrote, "In the responses to J.K. Rowling's challenge to the more extremist and vocal factions of transgender activists, there's been much more name-calling than reasoning. The most common such epithet has been to call her, or anyone else, a TERF, or trans-exclusionary radical feminist. Having been deeply involved in the science and clinical care of trans people for more than 2 decades, I've watched this particular term evolve and lose whatever meaning it originally had. It used to refer to the most extreme on the other side. There do indeed exist genuinely transphobic people who will refuse to recognize anyone's transition under any circumstances and are accurately called TERFs. Now just a social media meme, however, the term is bandied so broadly that it no longer carries any meaning at all. I must first challenge the ironically binary premise that exclusion is all or none. It's only in the current climate of extremism that no moderate views get discussed. Here is a range of some areas in which sex gender require protection: employment, housing, public accommodation, locker rooms, showers with nudity, sauna, hot tub, locker rooms, washrooms, sex-segregated competitive sports teams where physical size is an advantage. It would be perfectly accurate to call someone trans-exclusionary for rejecting trans people from all of these. But that's not meaningfully the same as, for example, a cis woman who supports all civil rights but feels uncomfortable naked in a locker room with a person whose every external feature is male, i.e., their female features are all internal. I'm not saying that I agree with this hypothetical cis woman. I am pointing out the error of painting this entire range of opinions with a single dichotomous brush and dismissing them all as if they were all the most extreme imaginable. Also on a spectrum is the point during transition at which one can, may, should be deemed which sex. Upon declaration, upon psych medical exam approval, upon declaration despite psych medical exam results, upon part-time social living, upon full-time social living, upon hormone treatment, upon genital surgery, or never. It is easy to recognize never as genuinely transphobic exclusionary, but it is not meaningful to use the same term for everyone who breaks from the opposite extreme, based only on a recent, sometimes even curiously convenient, self-declaration. Relatedly, there also exists debate over the age at which a youth should be permitted to begin to transition, socially and/or medically. Puberty, upon request, demand from child, age 12, mid-puberty, breaking point in outcomes research, age 16, usually age of consent for sex, age 18, legal age of adulthood, age 25, final brain maturation, or never. I support age 12. Again, this is James Cantor writing. I support age 12, not for any ideological reason, but because that is what the current evidence supports. The majority of prepubescent kids cease to feel trans during puberty, but the majority of kids who continue feel trans after puberty rarely cease. To someone who supports upon demand, however, everyone everywhere else on the spectrum is the same as the farthest opposite extreme. It is not meaningful to claim that wait until 12 is the same as to never. To repeat, I'm not actually taking sides on any of these issues except to indicate what is versus not consistent with the science. Rather, I am pointing out that TERF does not meaningfully convey anyone's ideas about anything. It is being used only as an epithet to discredit rather than inform, holding even the slightest symbolic evidence of the smallest departure from one extreme as proof of membership to the other extreme. It is being used as an excuse not to engage with what the person is actually saying. So he posted that. That sounds like he's not coming down. I think he even says it in the text. I'm not arguing one side or another. I'm just saying that these different terms, these different categories are collapsing discourse, and they're not really useful in a scientific context or a professional context or a context anywhere beyond an all-out ideological war, right? And this triggers a whole bunch of triggered people on this professional listserv, the Society for Scientific Study of Sex, or Quad-S. I'll get into this later, but it used to be the Society for the Scientific Study of Sex, but it has been expanded to the Society for the Scientific Study of Sexuality, as James Cantor in my interview will explain. So there's all these back and forth of people like going after him and saying that he's being transphobic or he's being harmful or whatever. And then we get to this one email. I'm reading it. I thought it was a parody, but it's not a parody. If you actually look at the person's site, you can see, well, okay, well, this person would have no reason to joke about this kind of stuff. So just listen to this. Dear James and community, I would just like to express a great sense of violence that I feel from being exposed to this conversation, particularly the points that rest on invalidating and undermining any person's claim of, you may not have intended to, but you're hurting me. Please stop. The act of finding logic or facts to reject another person's feelings is not only logically incorrect, given that all thoughts and feelings and experiences are valid, but it is also incredibly dehumanizing. I find this to be a violent act on its own, but especially so when it's perpetrated by people with dominant identities onto those who hold any number of subjugated identities. James, in fact, is Jewish and a homosexual, so he has some of those subjugated identities, right? But he's also got the lion's share of that pasty male identity that is the dominant identity. To continue, furthermore, I do not think it is incumbent on marginalized people to articulate a 5-point plan explaining precisely how and why a particular action is harmful. To the extent that they can and want to, that's great, especially if the other party is asking in good faith for the sake of growth, change, and mutual understanding, and not for the sake of simply undermining the argument. However, one does not need to fully understand something in order to accept it as true, e.g., gravity, dark matter, human engagement. Because ultimately, what I read from your desire to double down on your position and for someone to validate or refute the facts that you present, James, is that you either, 1, don't believe the other's claims that they are being harmed, and or 2, you don't care about their claim of harm because you don't agree. You are not harmed. Either position and subsequent behavior results in the justification of violence, i.e. harm, onto those who hold subjugated identities and or actual perpetration of violence. This is especially egregious, given that violence is an ever-present reality for members of subjugated communities, such as those who are trans-identified. You can see in the below threads some examples of excellent data about receipt of violence by members of this community, people who are literally dying. So what they're referring to is that somebody published the stats on murder rates, crime rates against trans individuals to shut down James, that he shouldn't be critiquing this argument. He shouldn't even be entering this argument if you don't want to agree with this argument, because people are literally dying. To continue, I don't see how you can simultaneously extol the process of science yet are willing to actively ignore information that your words and actions, and those of J.K. Rowling, for example, hurt people. I would argue that it is because of your societal positioning that you are willing to continually subject people to violence. All James has done is write an email and argued about that email for the sake of an intellectual discussion. Perhaps a discussion is warranted about how people with more power can keep themselves accountable to marginalized communities and their own growth as it relates to reducing harm and not violating people in the future. Because the more prevalent procedure of immediate actions of fear or anger or defensiveness, especially among those with power, following news of their perpetration of perhaps unintentional violence towards somebody with less power than them, is not working. See White Fragility, D'Angelo, or Darvo, Freyd, more for this. It is only reiterating violence because the perpetrator has proclaimed that their act was indeed not violent, and therefore there will be no change in the future, and dehumanization will continue. So even questioning whether an email is literally violence or causes literal dying through violence, even questioning that and asking for proof, asking for reasoning to that, is in and of itself violence. To continue, and perhaps those who are rightfully upset about the receipt of violence can be a bit more empathetic of the accident if the person commits to working to no longer perpetrating that form of violence. Because in the absence of change, or an ongoing commitment to affirming the humanity of all people in practice and not just in words, all future actions of violence are an informed choice. If you continue down this asking for proof and disagreeing until you see some proof about what you're claiming. And in the beginning, James wasn't even claiming anything other than the fact that the language has collapsed to such a point where it doesn't make any sort of sense, where you can't even actually have a conversation. And he gets canceled because the people don't want to have this conversation. Let's back up a little bit. Because in the absence of change or an ongoing commitment to affirming the humanity of all people in practice and not just in words, all future actions of violence are an informed choice. And that is unacceptable. Notably, I am operating on the premise that initial acts of violence are an unintentional product of ignorance. James was stating an informed opinion, and she's trying to shut that down because any sort of information contrary to what she wants, she's deeming ignorance. Even the pursuit of the reduction of ignorance, if it bats up against her ideology, is perpetuating violence and ignorance. And though something can be said about who is allowed to be ignorant and about what, I will refrain from delving further into that conversation. All in all, I'm not seeking to engage in a back and forth about the validity of my argument. You don't say. In fact, I will not. I know that I am valid in my assertion that I feel harmed, and that /y. Anyways, I wanted to share that so you guys have some context in which to peruse my conversation with James Cantor about the change within academia with regards to the open, free exchange of ideas and why it is in fact under threat across the board. These are not just isolated data points. I guess they are. I'm just collecting all this anecdote. I don't know at what point all of this anecdote becomes data, But it really does seem to be the case that this is the current climate. And I talked to the doctor about that in our interview. So stay tuned. What are you doing? What are you doing? Why are you stuck in there? How are you going to get out?